Hello everybody, this is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video you are about to see is the second in a series which I call PreteristPotpourri, in which I take up miscellaneous verses which probably should be interpreted better from a preterist viewpoint rather than a futurist viewpoint. If you're interested in studying preterist eschatology from the beginning, I would suggest that you find this playlist on the internet, Orthodox Preterist Playlist, and you can listen to videos that take up the Olivet Discourse, Revelation, and Daniel one by one. All right, in this video, I'm going to take up some miscellaneous preterist passages. We're going to start with several eschatological expressions that are used all the time and in which most people reflexively take to be the end of the world, namely coming. When we hear coming of Christ, does that mean that Jesus is coming at the end of the world? Last days, when we hear people say, oh, we're in the last days, does that mean the last period of time right before Jesus comes back? Day of the Lord, does that mean, oh, that's the end of the world when God comes back to judge all the world at the end of the world? I can show you beyond a shadow of a doubt that these words, although they may mean that, they do not have to exclusively mean that. In the scriptures, they often mean something else. And the other thing I'm going to take up in this section of my PowerPoint's miscellaneous preterist passages, I'm going to look at this passage in 2 Peter that people always say says that the world is going to burn up in fire, the elements melting in the heat. I love this passage because I think I can prove to you very clearly that that's not what Peter meant. All right, but in this particular video, we're just going to look at two things, the word coming and the word last days. So let's start with coming. I'm going to read you a verse that I read when I was in high school, I believe it was, perhaps college, but I remember the trouble it gave me because I was, as I say, was soaked in futurism, and I couldn't interpret this verse from a futurist perspective. This is Jesus talking to his disciples, and he says, when they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. You will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And of course, I thought to myself, well, now, how can that mean they won't go through the towns of Israel until the Son of Man comes back? In other words, they're going to take that long, 2,000 plus years, going through the cities of Israel, fleeing from one town to the next, and they will not have finished going through the towns of Israel 2,000 plus years when Jesus comes? Well, of course, that's absurd. Well, it just never occurred to me back then that comes does not all the time mean when Jesus is coming. It does not all the time mean he's coming at the second advent. It can mean that, but it doesn't have to. The other come verse that I'm going to use is in John 21, verse 22, which says this. Jesus said to him, Peter, he's talking to Peter, he says, if it is my will that he, referring to John, the Apostle John, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? And so I just assumed when I read that verse that Jesus is saying, look, if John wants to hang around for 2,000 plus years until I come, what do you care? I'm going to show you that doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's look at Matthew 10:23 first. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. You will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now, first question, how could this possibly mean the end of the world? Can we now see disciples going through Israel right now? Of course we can't. So that word comes right there cannot refer to the second coming of Jesus. Jesus is speaking to the 12 apostles about cities in Israel. He is not speaking to us about evangelizing the world, as that was the way it was always presented to me, a complete violation of logic and the context as well. It's interesting, there's a 1985 NIV study Bible that said that this passage right here, Matthew 10:23, was referring to the end of the world. But in the 1995 edition of the same NIV Study Bible, the people who wrote the notes said, no, this was referring to AD 70. It's amazing how long it takes to see the obvious. And this also illustrates that a more reasonable preterist approach is being used more and more now by Bible scholars as time goes on. And another thing that indicates that is how fast you will see futurist reaction to preterist presentations of preterist view of eschatology. Preterism is catching on, whether futurists like it or not, but that's what's happening. All right, now, let's look at the other coming verse that I want to talk about. John 21, verse 22 says this. Jesus said to him, talking to Peter, Jesus said to Peter, if it is my will that John remain until I come, what is that to you? Now, we've got three options as to what this coming could mean. First option, it could refer to Pentecost. So Jesus would be saying to Peter, if it is my will that John remains until I come, what is that to you? Pentecost, of course, was 50 days after Jesus was crucified. Jesus hung around on earth for 40 days before he was ascended into heaven. We know that from Acts 1. And then he spent 10 days in heaven. Then he sent the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. So that's option one, is that Jesus is saying to Peter, hey, if I want John to stay alive until 40 plus days from now, what do you care? That's the first option. The second option, it refers to the end of the world. So Jesus would be saying to Peter, if it is my will that John remains alive until I come to the end of the world, what do you care? I think you can see there's a problem with that. The other option, of course, is AD 70. So let's start with Pentecost. Pentecost is too close to the time when Jesus was speaking. What's the big deal about staying alive for a few weeks? All right, well, let's talk about the context of this verse a little bit. In the previous verses, Jesus told Peter, he said, look, you're going to stretch out your hands, indicating the manner in which Peter would die, John tells us. And so Peter now knows that he's going to be a martyr. And so then he asked about John. Well, what about John? Now, I don't know what is going through Peter's mind. He might have just been curious. Well, is John going to get killed, or is he going to stay alive? And we don't know. But Jesus is saying to Peter, look, it's none of your business, Peter. It doesn't matter. My dealings with John are not my dealings with you. If I want you to be crucified and John to stay alive until I come, that's my business. That's divine prerogative, if you will. Now, the question is how long was Jesus saying that John might remain alive? Well, that depended upon when Jesus comes back. Well, Pentecost is too short a time, because then Jesus would say, look, Peter, if I want John to remain alive for just a couple of weeks, you shouldn't be jealous of that. You shouldn't be concerned about that. Well, it's basically the same thing as saying that John's going to die at the same time as Peter, because a couple of weeks is almost negligible. So Pentecost is too close a time period here. The next option, the end of the world, that's too far away. How is Peter going to stay alive for 2,000 plus years? Jesus would be saying, look, Peter, if it's my will that John stays alive for 2,000 years, what do you care? Well, obviously, nobody can live for 2,000 plus years. John can't live that long. So that would be meaningless if Jesus meant the end of the world. But AD 70 is just right, because it is possible that John might live to AD 70, but that possibility is subject to doubt. And so he says, look, if I'm going to let John remain alive for several years until AD 70, what difference does it make? So that's a possibility. That John might actually make it to 87. As a matter of fact, John did make it to 87. He saw his predictions in the book of Revelation carried out when he saw Jerusalem go down, and when he learned about Jerusalem going down. So Jesus is saying, look, if I'm going to let John live several years beyond you, what difference does it make? It doesn't matter. All right, we finished with a couple of coming verses. Let's look now at last days instances in Scripture. Now, what I'm going to do, I've divided up a lot of last days verses, and the first selection of last days verses I'm going to say are unambiguously referring to 80/70. And as soon as I do that, that will puncture the idea that last days must refer to the end of time, which it does not. I'm going to also give you some verses that are ambiguous. They could be the end of time, or they could be 80/70. And the purpose of that is to say, well, look, you can't be dogmatic about saying the last days refers to the end of time. They might not. You could, but might not. And then I'm going to look at a special verse in 1 Peter 4:7-13, where Peter says that Jesus is near. All right, here's some unambiguous verses, last days verses that refer to 80/70. Acts 2:16-17. This is Peter speaking in his famous Pentecostal sermon. He says this, but this, referring to Pentecost, this Pentecost is what was spoken of through the prophet Joel. And it shall be in the last days, God says, that I will pour forth my spirit on all mankind. Well, when were the last days that Peter was talking about? He fulfilled Joel's prophecy at that time, at Pentecost, when all those people got saved. They all started speaking in tongues, and all the apostles heard everybody speaking in their own language. That was not the end of the world. And here, Peter explicitly says that this is the last days. He says this, T-H-I-S, capital T-H-I-S, this, let me point that out to you, this, in referring to Pentecost, is what was spoken of by Joel. Pentecost was spoken of by Joel, and Joel said it shall be in the last days. So when Joel says that Pentecost is in the last days, that means that Pentecost is in the last days, and that's not at the end of the world. Here's another one, Hebrews 1:2. God in these last days has spoken to us in his Son. Well, obviously, the author of Hebrews is talking about the gospel age. Christians have been spoken to in Christ, in his Son. And the author says that occurred in these last days. That's my favorite verse to go to very quickly. It's very obvious. That refers to 80/70, not the end of the world. Now here's James 5, verse 3, verse 8, and verse 9. James says this, it is in the last days that you, wicked rich people, have stored up your treasure. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. The judge is standing right at the door. Well, here James says that the last days are near. Well, if the last days were at the very end of the world, how could James say they're near? I mean, what part of near do we not understand? Near means soon. So the last days are near, and then what about this? The judge, Jesus, is standing right at the door. He was referring to the rich, nasty people in Jerusalem who were about to get their heads kicked in the Jewish war, in the Jewish rebellion. He was prophesying it in advance. All right, so those verses clearly refer to 80/70. I've got some more. Here's 1 Peter 1, verses 5 and 20. Peter says this, he's talking to you who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. The Christians he was talking to were protected for the salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. Was that salvation then, or was that salvation in the future? Well, let's read on. For he, Christ, was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but has appeared. That's past perfect. Excuse me, that's a perfect tense. I think it's present perfect, but it's a tense that is in the past, has appeared. When? In these last times. So Christ appeared in the last times, in the last days. 1 Peter 1, 5 and 20. How about 1 John 2:18? Children, it is, notice the verb here. Notice the verb. It is the last hour. It is the last hour. Not it will be the last hour 2,000 plus years at the end of the world, but no, it is the last hour. And just as you've heard that Antichrist is coming, even now, many Antichrists have appeared. There's a present perfect tense again, which indicates the past. And many antichrists have appeared. From this you know that it is the last hour. So very clearly, Peter, James, John, they all took the last days to mean the end of the Jewish era and the beginning of the New Covenant era. And I don't see how anybody can quibble over that. I think serious futurist scholars know this, of course, but the popular futurist writers who always talk about the last days, the last days, the last days, they never mention this. But you're watching this video and now you know. Now here's some references to last days, which I've classified as ambiguous. Isaiah 2:2-4. When I say ambiguous, I mean you refer them to 80-70 or perhaps in at the end of the world. Isaiah 2:2-4 says this, and now it will come about that in the last days the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief mountain. Mountain of the house of the Lord is Mount Zion, because that's where Mount Zion is where the temple was. And that's a symbol for the church. The mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief mountain, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come in and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, Mount Zion, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, that we may walk in his paths. And I could say with a good deal of confidence that Isaiah is using Old Testament language to refer to the fulfillment in the New Testament. People flocking into the church of Christ. As I said, Mount Zion, that's a typical symbol for the church of Christ. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. Now that does sound at the end of the world. And that, of course, is the famous United Nations verse that they have written on the outside of their building up there in New York on the East River. And they think they're going to bring peace to the world without Jesus. They're a bunch of morons. It's not going to happen. All right, well, I'm willing to say that this might have a future reference. Why? Because we don't have this total peace yet. Now, you could say that Isaiah was being hyperbolic, and he was just talking about all the peace of Christ, because we're all at peace with God, and the peace of Christ will guard our hearts in Christ Jesus, and we're in the kingdom now, and that's why we're at peace with God and with each other as Christians. And so that could refer perhaps to the New Covenant church now. I would make a strong argument. I'm not going to argue with anybody on that one. Some people say, some futurists say it refers to the millennium. I don't believe in a future millennium, so I don't believe that. It could refer to the final state, however, where there's perfect peace. All right, so we'll leave that one ambiguous. How about 1 Timothy 4:1-3? But the Spirit explicitly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith. Now, this verse is a favorite one for futurists who are trying to tell us that at the end of the world there's going to be a great apostasy, and only 2 or 3 or 4 people, maybe 5 people on earth will believe in Jesus, and all the churches will die, and everybody will leave the churches, and we'll have apostasy everywhere, the so-called great apostasy. This, of course, completely violates Jesus' parable of the leaven and the bread and the mustard seed, where the little tiny mustard seed grows and makes this big tree, so all the birds from all the nations can rest in the tree, and the gospel of the kingdom is spreading all over the place. Completely violates what Jesus said. So that's why I don't believe that this verse refers to the later times. Why would Paul warn Timothy of events which Timothy and Timothy's great-great-grandchildren and 50 or more generations of Timothy's descendants, they would never live to see it? Why would he be talking to Timothy, warning him about, in these latter times, there's going to be a lot of problems, so you got to be ready, Timothy? If he was talking about the end of the world, it was absolutely irrelevant to Timothy. Irrelevant. Completely irrelevant. All right, let's look at another last days verse, 2 Timothy 3:1. But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. Now, Paul is writing of times here that are relevant to Timothy, who lived at the end of the Old Covenant. Let me read some more verses from this chapter, verses 5, 6, and 8. Paul tells Timothy, avoid such men as these. And these men are the people who are rebellious and disobedient to parents, and they're lovers of pleasure, and they're all these evil people that he lists. He says, avoid such men as these, for among them are those who enter into household. That's a present tense. That's not future at the end of the world. That's now. They're entering into households now, as Paul writes to Timothy. They enter into households and they captivate weak women. They're doing it now, not at the end of the world. So these men also oppose the truth. Oppose is in the present tense. Now, all these examples that Paul gives in verses 5, 6, and 8 illustrate the main point that he made in verse 1, which is, realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. The last days, difficult times will come because of all these evil people. Timothy, in my humble opinion, was not talking about the end of the world. I guess you could make an argument that he was, but such an admonition would be completely irrelevant to Timothy. I don't know why Paul would write that to him. 2 Peter 3:3 says this, know this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come where they're mocking. Well, there's not enough context there to know whether that's 80, 70, it very well could be. It also could be at the end of the world that people will mock what they're mocking. So I will admit that might refer to the end of the world, but doesn't necessarily have to. Now, Jude 1:18 says this, in the last time there will be mockers, following their own ungodly lust. Now, these mockers are first century people, and they are referred to as being in the last time. Verse 12, 4 verses later, these are the men who are hidden wreaths in your love feast, when they feast with you without fear. They're feasting with you now in your love feast. And these mockers, and therefore these mockers, are first century people, because Jude is writing to first century people who are having agape love feast, communion meals, with these hidden wreaths. They're having it back then, not 2,000 plus years in the future. Verse 17, Jude says this, but you, beloved, again talking to the Christians back then, but you, beloved, ought to remember the words that were spoken beforehand by the apostles. You, beloved. And verse 19, these are the ones who cause divisions in the present tense, not will cause divisions at the end of the world. I think that's fairly clear, although you could make an argument it happens at the end of the world. Doesn't sound like it to me. Now let's look at another last days verse. Actually, this, I've got it labeled as ambiguous. This to me is so clearly not the last days. It really isn't ambiguous. I probably have this in the wrong place. Genesis 49:1. And Jacob called unto his sons. This is when Jacob gives his famous blessing at the end of Genesis to his 12 sons. And he said, gather yourselves together, get together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Well, was he talking to his children, the future patriarchs of Israel, telling them what's going to happen when the black helicopters come and the nuclear bombs come? No. He was telling them what's going to happen in the near future. And in fact, the New American Standard Bible translates that phrase, last days, as in the days to come. In other words, in the next few days, in the next few years of the patriarchs' lives. Here's Micah 4:1-2. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established. Now this one's ambiguous, and in fact, I've got two traditional commentators. When I say traditional, they're not exactly preterists, but they took a lot more preterist positions than dispensationalists do, and they wrote before dispensationalists showed up in the mid-1800s. And I'm referring to Adam Clarke, the great Arminian commentator, and John Gill, the great Calvinist commentator of the 19th century. They referred these latter days of Micah 4:1-2, they said that those latter days refer to the times of the Messiah. The former days being the times of Israel, the Old Covenant, the latter days being the times of the New Covenant. It shall come to pass in the latter days in the mountain of the house of the Lord. That's the mountain is where the house of the Lord was, and Mount Zion, that's the symbol of the church. So the church shall be established in the times of the Messiah. So say Clarke and Gill. However, Guzik, who is a dispensationalist commentator who I use sometimes, he refers that to the millennium. Futurists always refer anything that has last days in it, they just automatically either go to the millennium or to the tribulation, the so-called great tribulation in the future, maybe even to the final state, I don't know, but they just cannot take take a last days verse and put it in the past, despite the fact there's so many verses, as I've showed you, that clearly refer to the past. Hosea 3:5 says this, "Afterward the children of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God, and David their king, and they shall come in fear to the Lord in the latter days." And I believe that's a prediction of the times of the Messiah. The latter days is the time of the church, the time of the new covenant. And Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown, a traditionalist commentator of the 19th century, they said that refers to the times of the Messiah, and I agree with them perfectly. Guzik, dispensationalist and a futurist, says it's the millennium. So you see, you can go either way on some of these verses because you can't tell by the context. However, there's enough verses that you can tell by the context to see that latter days often, if not most of the time, refers to something other than the end of the world. Now let's look at an odd couple of verses here, a miscellaneous couple of verses, 1 Peter 4, 7, and 13. Peter says this, "The end of all things is near." I've got it capitalized and in red. "The end of all things is near. Therefore be of sound judgment. Keep on rejoicing, so that also at the revelation of his glory you may rejoice with exultation." When was the revelation of his glory going to be? Well, whenever Peter was writing, I assume it was sometime before 80, 70 sometime, he said the end of all things is near. Now, near, what part of near do we not understand? Near means soon, not 2,000 plus years, at the end of the world. Dropping down to verse 17 in 1 Peter 4, we read this, "For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. And if it begins with us first, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God?" Now, the judgment that's going to begin with the household of God, that is the persecution, or it most probably is, the persecution that the church was receiving from the unbelieving and rebellious Jews, the apostate Jews. So, yes, they were having judgment from them, but that happened first. But later, the outcome was that those who do not obey the gospel of God, they're going to have some kind of indescribable judgment. What will be the outcome for these people? Well, that's referring to the disobedient Jews who were wiped out in AD 70, most probably. So the revelation of his glory most probably is referring to Jesus coming to take vengeance on his murderers. All right, next video, I am going to take up this passage in 2 Peter 3, in which Peter says the elements will melt in heat, in which futurists take to refer to the burning up of the world at the end of time. And then I'm going to look at this nice eschatological phrase, day of the Lord. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time.